Hello, thinkers. We're back again for another very exciting podcast. And today we're going to be talking about biblical genetics with Dr. Rob Carter. And this is going to be a fascinating podcast. And so welcome, Dr. Rob. And could I just call you Rob?
Rob is great. I call you Tim. You call me Rob.
We've actually had an opportunity to meet and to get to know each other from an earlier film because you helped me with the Red Sea Miracle. Why don't you just share with the audience a little bit about your background, because you work for Creation Ministries International, and you have a YouTube channel called Biblical Genetics. There's a lot that's going on, but you're also a marine biologist, right?
I am trained as a marine biologist. That's my background. So I've had PhD level courses in marine physics and marine chemistry and marine geology and lots of coral reef ecology. I got my doctorate working on genetics and pulling genes out of corals and putting them into fish. So I made green fish and red fish for my doctorate. I am a speaker and a writer and a scientist for Creation Ministries International. That's creation.com. I am a member of the Creation Research Society. I'm actually their membership secretary. And I have a YouTube channel called Biblical Genetics.
And you've done a couple other things. You've been in a documentary called Is Genesis History? And another one called Dismantled, a Scientific Deconstruction of the Theory of Evolution.
Yes, and also Evolution's Achilles Heels. That was my brainchild that CMI produced about 10 years ago.
You've got a lot of experience, and this is going to be a very important discussion. And so if we think about this, why is creation science important, first of all?
Creation science is important, even though the Bible is not a science book. The Bible touches on science, and it shouldn't be wrong. If it's wrong about the science, well, the same people who wrote the science also wrote the history and also wrote all the theology. And if they got one area of knowledge completely wrong, then how do we know about the rest?
You're presenting evidence that helps affirm the reliability of Genesis. So, and one thing that people may not know, or they might know about you, is that you used to be an evolutionist, right?
I was, as a young man, an evolutionist. I like to say I didn't know any better. I had never heard anyone who didn't believe in evolution until I was like 18 or 19 years old, and I thought those people were crazy, and now I am one of those people, so...
What happened to you? What caused you to move from being, an 18 or 19-year-old evolutionary thinker to a person today now who's got his PhD and is telling people that there's a pattern of evidence or a scientific connection here that we see a creator? What was that story like? What happened to you?
When I got to college, I fell in with a group of dedicated Christians, and I had never really met any before. And they started challenging me on a lot of things. But there was a penny drop moment for me. I was in a conversation with a lady. She's still a good friend of mine. She's a lot older than me then. She's actually the mom of one of my friends. And I basically said, "Oh, evolution's a fact." And she goes, "Why do you think so?" And I threw something that I thought at the time was the greatest evidence of evolution ever. And that was something called Pakicetus. And I had this image in my head from National Geographic of this perfectly formed transitional fossil diving down it like paddle-like flipper feet, and it was like halfway a cow and halfway a whale, and I was done. That's all the evidence for evolution I needed. And she goes, "Don't you know they just found the rest of the skeleton?" I said, "What?" And yeah, it turns out that Pakicetus, if you see a depiction today, it looks like a 4-foot long, kind of like a rat, kind of like a dog, and has zero transitional features. It doesn't have paddle-like flippers. It has legs. It doesn't have a flat tail. It has a regular tail. I mean, everything about it is a land-based animal. And I said, I think someone pulled the wool over my eyes. What else do I have to unlearn? I was probably about 19 or 20 when that happened. And since then, it's been a lifetime of unlearning and learning more about the Bible, more about creation science, and how the things work together.
We intend in the future to go into creation and the origins. And I believe origin is important. One of my strengths in my own life is context. and I need to have context in order for me to somewhat figure out where my compass is. And but I think that as I've been looking at telling story, understanding the beginning from the end, I mean, that's part of what a story does. You have to have a plot, as it were. And the Bible talks about this creation in the first 2 verses of Genesis. And did that fascinate you?
Yeah, in the beginning, there's nothing except a ball of water. The Bible doesn't actually say where that came from. But then God said, let there be light. He separates the waters from above from the waters below, creates the oceans, creates the heavens. There's debate amongst us on what the waters above mean. Some people say it's just clouds. Some people say, no, that water made the stars and the galaxies. The context of Genesis changes everything you think about the nature of the universe. If there's a God, we don't live in a naturalistic universe. We don't live in a universe that is ruled by natural forces. Now, natural forces are constant because God, who made them, is constant, but that doesn't mean that God's not allowed to intervene, making a miracle, or making the world, and making life, and making people.
What are the definitions of the way, let's say, a secular mind looks at things?
Starting in about the 1700s, during the Enlightenment period, the philosophers, basically, not really the scientists so much, but the philosophers started appealing to a universe that operates according to a set of rules, which actually developed from Christian theology in the past centuries. They said, hey, if God is true, God's a lawgiver, God's going to create a universe that operates according to law. Well, they took that day of law and they got rid of God, and they said, okay, now we have this thing called naturalism. It's the belief that nature's all there is. It's the belief that natural processes are the only things that you can use as an explanation of anything that's ever happened. So no miracles, no intervention of any outside entity, just physics and chance. And from that, we have Big Bang Theory, we have the origin of life, we have evolution, all these other things that kind of come out of that mindset. But I don't believe in naturalism. I believe in theism. I believe in God. And if there's a God, naturalism is not true.
I've got the poster for the Moses controversy behind me, and if I think about the first 5 books of the Bible, the controversy in the beginning was, did Moses actually write the first 5 books of the Bible? Because they've got the documentary hypothesis, which means that there were 4 or 5 authors that actually wrote this hundreds and hundreds of years after the facts. And that they're not even facts, but they're just a mythology that was created. But Moses, I really believe, and the Bible tells us that Moses existed. Jesus talks about Moses, and it was Moses who penned from the inspiration, of God, the first 5 books, including Genesis, which is telling us how we began. What is at stake in this debate of how we came into being?
Well, that's a tricky question, because I'm not going to say that, hey, if you don't believe in creation, you can't be a Christian. That's not true. To be a Christian is really simple. You have to believe that Jesus is God, that he died to pay for your sins, and that he rose from the grave. That's really simple. But those statements are couched upon a history and a structure of thought that includes the entire Old Testament. And Jesus quoted from the Old Testament. Jesus quoted directly from the book of Genesis. Jesus quoted in John chapter 10, in the beginning. Well, that's the opening words of the scroll of Genesis right there. And he says, God made male and female, and he linked them together, and et cetera. It's just, Jesus quotes directly from Genesis and never puts any caveats. And if Jesus is really God, he would have known if Genesis is true or not. So when he says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, and he talks about Adam, well, did Jesus believe that Adam existed at the beginning of creation? Then he didn't believe in evolution, because evolution requires billions of years to produce Homo sapiens. We come at the end of creation, not the beginning. Plus, when you talk about Moses, if Moses didn't write those earlier books, or at least edited some earlier historical documents, how did he know certain things that later authors would never have known? names of cities, routes through the wilderness, even like the new one I just discovered recently. I think it's in the Brooklyn Papyrus. You've got a list of slaves held by individual people in Egypt, some of them with very Hebrew-sounding names, and a list of slaves who escaped prison. Well, prison? There's no prisons in the Code of Hammurabi. There's no prisons in the Old Testament law. If you sin, you're either going to be killed, or you have to pay money or do something to fix the problem that you caused. So that Joseph was thrown into prison is a weird thing for Moses to write, except now we know from this papyrus that there indeed were prisons in Egypt around that time frame. That's just really cool little tidbit. There's thousands of those in the Old Testament.
Discussing the topic of origins also brings up several different viewpoints within the overall debate. There are people that believe that God used evolution in creation. There are some people that believe that God created everything, but it took billions of years for us to get to the point where God started creating mankind. So, Rob, how should people think about these things? I know that you settled on a literal 7-day creation and a young earth approach. Why do you believe this view is important to be seriously considered from a scriptural and an evidential perspective?
Well, it just raises up the question of if the Bible's true or not. I mean, the Bible's written like history. The book of Genesis is written very clearly like history. It's not poetry, even though there might be some poetry in it. It's not prophecy, even though there might be some prophecy in it. It is historical narrative. That's how it's written. And if it's historical narrative, we have a hard time adding millions or billions of years to that narrative. I mean, there's lots of ways to express long periods of time in Hebrew, and none of them are used in Genesis 1. I mean, in one sense, I kind of wish there was one in Genesis 1, because then I could take the millions of years truck and just drive right through that gap, and my life would be so much easier if I just agreed with everyone else in the world, but I can't. I'm constrained not to, because the words are very clear. The later usages of the passages that tell us how old the earth is in Genesis are very clear that the authors believed them to be true. They didn't add, this guy wrote that, but we really know it means this. They never said that later on in the Bible. So if you wanted to say God created the entire universe in 6 consecutive days, you would write it just like it's written in Genesis 1. But then there's other history in the Bible. There's long genealogical lists. And when you add up the time frame that those genealogies give us, they clearly indicate the Earth's only thousands of years old. In fact, I wrote an article, it's on creation.com. One of my favorite articles is called The Biblical Minimum and Maximum Age of the Earth. And in it, my co-author and I, we looked at all the places in the Bible that have something to do with dating the Earth. And we said, okay, what can that mean? How far can we stretch that? And how much can we compress it? And we tried to not give an exact age, but a range of possible ages. Like, for example, Seth is born when Adam is 130 years old. Well, Seth is probably not born on Adam's birthday. He's born somewhere in Adam's 130th year. Well, that's an accuracy of plus or minus 6 months on average. So by the time you go from Adam to Abraham, that's 20 generations. You're already off by plus or minus 10 years. So we looked at all the things we could do, and we could not even get the age of the earth to 8,000 years. If you take the Septuagint Bible, which has longer dates than the Masoretic Bible, which is our basis of our English Bibles, you can get to about 7,500. But using a Masoretic straightforward approach, you get about 6,000 years, just a little more than 6,000 years. And that's what it says. The question is, can we deal with that? Can we explain the fossil record? Can we explain carbon dating? Can we explain starlight and time in just thousands of years? Well, the answer is yes, but we have to be very careful as we step through the issues. Typically, people take a very brief reading of Scripture, and then they try to throw things at it that don't quite fit. And sometimes a person can go for many years. I did it myself, many years, with a view that doesn't work, but you don't realize it doesn't work. Like, my first approach was the day-age theory. I didn't know what it was called, but someone said, hey, what if each of the days is really a long period of time? I said, oh, okay, that solves it. We got millions of years. We got the book of Genesis. Both are true at the same time. And then years later, someone pointed out, said, hey, Rob, how can you get plants on day 3 if the sun was created millions of years later on day 4? Genesis is set up so that no naturalistic explanation actually works. The order of events is all wrong. And a day is a day, and, etc. Yeah, so there's a lot of things. In fact, Creation.com, we have a lot of articles on the starlight and time issue, on the age of the Earth issue, all sorts of questions we've tried to answer comprehensively on our website.
I had a man come up to me after the Exodus film came out, and he said, I just want to tell you how thankful. I was at a wedding, and it was at the reception, and he just came up and cornered me and said, this is after, like I said, the Exodus film came out, and he says, I just want you to know how significant your film was. And I said, well, what did it do for you? And he says, it made me bold. And I think that I would encourage you to go to this website, because there's a certain boldness that all of us need to have where we feel more confident in our faith. If you've got big questions, I also, Rob, talked about there are a lot of Christian agnostics out there. So what is an agnostic? Is someone who has questions, right? And there's an agnostic who says, I just don't know anything. But I'm saying that they might be more agnostic than they are a person of faith, because they haven't really, grabbed onto it. And there are some things that we have to accept with faith. I was at a movie theater where I showed the Exodus film, and this afterwards, this is in Branson, Missouri, this man, he must have been about 6'9". He was the biggest guy I had probably ever seen in person. He was a giant, and I think I had unsettled him. All the evidence was there, but he just didn't want to be uncomfortable. He just said, I believe it, and that's all I need. And I said, that's great. Don't pick me up and throw me. Okay. But I also know that I've also talked with some people. I had a family that helped us with our first film, and they told me a sad story that has, I think, a better ending to it now. But their teenage son was inquisitive, and he had lots of questions. And there's a lot of young people today that have questions. He had some questions, and his youth pastor kind of just said, hey, don't worry about it. Come on, let's go get some pizza. Well, that wasn't the right answer for him. He needed to ask some questions about origin, because he's in high school. He's getting all this other information, and then he goes to church, and he's got this other thing. He went to college, and he came back after Thanksgiving and said, announced to his parents, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any of this. And I think once he kind of worked through those troubled waters, he was able to then, I think, kind of come back, because that's a vacant ideology that has nothing for the person in their spirit and their soul, with no answers, and it just leads to tragedy, I think, for a lot of people. Rob, you probably have many, many testimonies of people who've been struggling with these questions. What would you say? We're going to come back with another podcast in a little bit here, but how would you encourage people that have a student that is wondering about whether this Christianity and this faith in a God who created all things?
May I suggest 2 resources that people can find on Creation.com? One of them is a small book called How to Graduate with Your Faith Intact. It's an excellent read. It's 40 or 50 pages, but it hits some really hard-hitting questions, and is designed for someone in that 18, 19, 20-year-old zone who's really wrestling. I mean, is it really my religion, or is that mommy and daddy's religion? That's a hard question to go through, and that How to Graduate with Your Faith Intact will help a lot. But we also we have a documentary. It's only 35 minutes long. We call it Fallout. We took a TV camera to 5 or 6 college campuses, and we interviewed hundreds of students on the street. And we found 100 students who said that they grew up going to church. And we asked them, okay, what's true, creation or evolution? 5 of them said creation. 95 of them said evolution. And we said, were you ever taught anything about creation or evolution? And the 5 that said yes were also the 5 that believed it. The other 95 said they had never heard of it. And then we said, do you still go to church? And only 1 of the 95 said, yeah, I still go to church. So what we found was that, churches that preach us from the pulpit and Sunday schools that talk about this, families that have these conversations over the dining room table, were raising young Christians that were much more affirmed in their faith and much more willing to say, yeah, I'm a Christian, in an incredibly anti-Christian environment called the American university. And it was that the formula was so clear that if we don't have our basic questions about origins answered, what's the point of Christianity? Just saying.
This is really important. So that is a booklet. I was just thinking about this. I've got 8 grandchildren. Why don't you think, if you're listening to this, of getting that booklet and either using it with your children or make a special event. Some of the things we like to do is like go out to a breakfast and just kind of say, hey, we're going to have breakfast. We're going to talk about this and maybe have it over the course of several weeks or a month or so where you could go through this material. The other thing that I've seen is that there are so many answers that help with biblical archaeology, with the credibility of the Bible, that just have not been given to people. So they're unprepared for that. So when we come back, we can talk more about that. And we're going to be talking about biblical genetics, but I wanted to do a little bit of background before we got started. So, hey, thinkers, we'll be back in the next podcast talking a little bit more about biblical genetics, why it's important, and why it's important for you and your family to know this so that they don't go off to college and just say, hey, I don't believe in any of this anymore. Thanks again. Keep on thinking.